Welcome to the ProTicker Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for an essential exploration of the foundational energy systems of the future. We're not just looking at one trend, but the powerful collision of three massive forces demanding really trillions in new investment globally. We're talking about the definitive resurgence of nuclear power, the desperate chronic need for transmission and grid expansion, and of course, the intense disruptive appetite for power driven by artificial intelligence.
It's an absolutely essential moment for this conversation because, as you noted, these forces aren't isolated. They're all colliding right now. You can see it in the boardrooms of utilities and the halls of government and in, the big investment decisions being made. It's forcing these rapid, long-term structural changes that are going to redefine the global power map for decades. Our mission today is to dive deep into the shared source material and really separate the hype from the reality.
Especially with those AI power demands, right?
Especially with AI.
Yeah.
We want to show you exactly where the core facts lie and, most importantly, where the capital is flowing across that entire supply chain. I'm talking from the furthest uranium mine all the way to the companies building the smartest grid technology.
Okay, let's unpack this enormous challenge. The big picture here seems to be defined by two interlocking needs: reliability and deep decarbonization.
That's it.
We are talking about securing the future of reliable, low-carbon baseload power and building that robust, resilient infrastructure you need, and not just to meet climate goals, but to simultaneously support the entire digital economy, which is, frankly, powered by nothing less than continuous, clean electricity.
Right.
So let's start with what has become perhaps the most significant comeback story of the energy decade: nuclear energy.
For almost 20 years, particularly in Western economies, nuclear power was largely in retreat. It was defined by premature phase-outs, driven by policy, and these high-profile project failures, which were all driven by cost. That era is definitively over. We are now experiencing a clear global revival driven by a recognition of nuclear's indispensable role in achieving stable, low-carbon baseload power.
And the scale of this projected turnaround is truly significant. I was looking at the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and their projections are they're massive.
They really are. They're forecasting at least a one-third increase in existing global nuclear capacity by 2035.
One-third. So we're not just stabilizing, we're growing substantially.
Exactly. And if you look further out, global capacity is expected to soar from about 420 gigawatts electrical, or GW, in 2024 to around 728 GW by 2050. That's just under current policy trajectories. And this convergence is where you see leverage. 2025 is actually expected to mark a record high in global nuclear electricity generation.
So surpassing all the prior peaks from the 80s.
Surpassing everything. And that rebound isn't just theory. It's already visible in the construction figures globally. Right now, there is over 70 GW of new nuclear capacity under construction worldwide. That level of new build activity is the highest we've seen in 3 decades. It just demonstrates this deep, long-term commitment.
So where is that growth truly concentrated? Is it spread out evenly?
Oh, no, it's heavily concentrated,
Yeah.
primarily in Asia and the Middle East. China is the undeniable powerhouse. They're aiming to achieve energy independence and clean air targets at the same time. But India is also aggressively expanding its homegrown fleet of pressurized heavy water reactors, or PHWRs.
And they favor those because they can use natural uranium, right? Avoids the whole enrichment process.
Exactly. It avoids a very complicated and geopolitically sensitive process.
Yeah.
Then you have the Middle East, particularly the UAE and potentially Saudi Arabia. They're committing to nuclear for baseload stability. They see it as crucial for water desalination and, long-term economic diversification away from oil.
But even outside those growth markets, the geopolitical shift in the West is profound. I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a huge wake-up call.
It was a stark reminder of the severe energy security vulnerabilities, especially in Europe, where gas supplies were basically weaponized.
Right.
And that crisis prompted countries that had definitive nuclear phase-out plans, like Japan, which is now restarting idle reactors, and possibly others like South Korea and Belgium, to reconsider or just reverse those phase-outs entirely. They now see nuclear not just as a climate tool, but as a critical strategic asset for achieving genuine energy independence.
A stable energy source that isn't reliant on, volatile global gas markets.
Precisely. And that change in strategic thinking is perhaps the biggest driver for the West's renewed interest.
Okay, that structural shift brings us directly to the real game changer that investors and utilities seem to be focused on: small modular reactors, SMRs. So if the last generation of plans was all about these massive, multi-billion-dollar bespoke projects, SMRs seem to be about something totally different.
It's a fundamental shift. It's about industrialized manufacturing, flexibility, and scalability.
And what's the size we're talking about here?
SMRs are typically sized between 50 and 300 MeO, so a fraction of a traditional 1,000-plus MW reactor. But the innovation is key. They use modular components that can be factory fabricated under strict quality control.
And then shipped to a site for assembly.
Exactly. That's the promise that should finally drive down costs and slash deployment timelines compared to those, gigawatt-scale custom-built plants that were notorious for decades of delays. SMR tech is now widely seen as critical for the industry's future viability in the West.
The development pace seems intense. Our sources show something like 70 SMR designs are in various stages of development globally. But the big question is always, are they actually hitting the ground, or are they still just models on a computer?
We have concrete commercial and demonstration timelines now. In Canada, Ontario Power Generation, OPG, is moving fast. They're targeting 2029 for the first 300 MeO SMR at its Darlington site.
And the U.S. is key for Western adoption. What's happening there?
So in the U.S., NuScale Power's 77 MeO design was the first, and so far the only, SMR designed to receive design certification from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. And that regulatory approval is monumental. It validates the design for commercial use. Now, you have a consortium NuScale, IntraI and the TVA already planning for a fleet of up to 6 GW of SMRs in the 2030s.
And that's the Lightwater design. But we're also seeing these high-profile demonstration projects focused on more advanced generation Levy designs.
Yeah.
They offer different features, right?
That's where the tech is really pushing the envelope. Look at the U.S. demo projects aiming for the late 2020s. X-Energy's 80 MeO X100. It's a high-temperature gas reactor. It's slated for a Dow chemical plant in Texas by 2029. And that's a critical development because high-temp reactors can produce process heat for industrial uses, not just electricity.
And then there's TerraPower's ambitious project, the one backed by Bill Gates.
It's exactly. TerraPower's 345 microwave natrium fast reactor. It just broke ground in Wyoming in 2024. It uses liquid sodium as a coolant and aims for operation by 2030. These prototypes are testing fundamentally different systems. They're trying to prove the viability of gen-the-field tech, which promises enhanced safety, better waste management. They aren't just small versions of old tech, they're new platforms entirely.
Meanwhile, China and Russia are already operating prototypes and seem to have a much less contentious regulatory path.
They have a clear first-mover advantage. China's 200 MeO high-temperature gas SMR started feeding its grid back in 2021. And Russia uses small floating reactors to power remote Arctic towns, which demonstrates that decentralized, mobile nature of the tech. These projects show that the core SMR technology is already moving from the drawing board to the grid, even if the utility-scale rollout in the West still faces hurdles.
And this brings us right to that convergence point, the element that's really fueling the investment thesis right now. The IEA has highlighted this immediate tension between SMRs and the massive growth in AI-driven power demand.
This is a powerful, almost unforeseen market catalyst. Tech companies are now the energy procurers of last resort. They've expressed intense interest and signed agreements for what the IEA estimates is up to 30 GW of SMR capacity globally.
To power future data centers.
To power data centers in the coming decades. And why SMRs? Because data centers need reliable 24/7 carbon-free baseload power. And they need it fast, often in locations that have tight grid capacity. SMRs, with their smaller footprint and that promise of standardized, repeatable deployment, they're uniquely positioned to serve that hyper-localized, continuous need.
So it's creating a brand new, highly motivated customer base for a nuclear industry that spent decades just chasing reluctant utilities.
Precisely. Tech companies are looking 15 to 20 years out. They're trying to secure their power supply today, knowing that grid bottlenecks, which we'll get to later, will only get worse. This convergence means the nuclear industry now has a massive, well-capitalized buyer demanding the product, which significantly increases the likelihood that these first-of-a-kind SMR projects actually get financed and built.
That momentum sounds incredible, but we need to ground the narrative in reality here. We can't talk about a nuclear renaissance without acknowledging the industry's painful history of execution failures, especially the infamous cost overruns and delays in the West. That baggage still weighs heavily on investors.
It absolutely does, and it's the first question every analyst asks. The infamous examples, they hang like a cloud over the entire industry. It's what makes standardized SMR deployment a necessity, not just a preference. I mean, think of the Vogtle 3 and Magadah 4 reactors in Georgia.
Right. They took, what, 7 years longer than planned and cost around $30 billion?
Roughly, yeah. A crippling blow to the confidence of utility executives and private financiers. And France's Flamanville EPR project is a similar cautionary tale: prolonged delays, massive budget increases.
These large-scale failures really showed that without a mature, predictable supply chain and a supportive regulatory environment, large nuclear projects are just uninsurable black holes for capital.
Exactly. These issues made investors, especially in North America and Europe, incredibly wary of committing capital to any new nuclear endeavor. The only way forward for large-scale nuclear, therefore, is through massive state backing and policy certainty.
But the narrative is indeed starting to shift. It suggests that, for large projects, maybe the industry has learned some hard lessons. Or, maybe more realistically, government policy support is now strong enough to absorb some of that risk.
That's the balance we see today. Large projects are indeed returning, but with significant state backing. France, for example, is planning at least 6 new large EPRs by 2035. They view this as a core component of their national security. Britain is deep into constructing Hinkley Point C and already planning Sizewell C. These aren't private ventures, they are state-driven mandates.
And we're seeing this in Eastern Europe too, right? They're locking in large-scale capacity.
Yes. Countries like Poland, Czechia, and Romania are signing up for proven U.S. and Korean designs, aiming for deployment in the 2030s. For them, it's about replacing retiring coal plants and securing reliable power against the backdrop of an aggressive Russia. It's an energy security play, first and foremost.
And crucially, the policy support isn't just for new construction, it's also helping the existing fleet survive, which is a massive factor in maintaining U.S. baseload capacity.
That's the unsung hero of the American nuclear story. The Biden administration astutely recognized the immediate importance of keeping the existing zero-carbon fleet running. They extended production tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and launched the $6 billion Civil Nuclear Credit Program.
And that was specifically to prevent premature closures.
Specifically, to stop struggling reactors from closing down because of high operating costs and low power prices.
And how did that translate into financial stability for the operators?
It fundamentally changed the calculation for them. For major operators like Constellation Energy, the largest U.S. nuclear plant owner, it was a lifeline. They reported that these supports, combined with higher market power prices, significantly stabilized and bolstered their nuclear fleet's earnings. It was an essential move to protect existing clean assets.
So while the West is recovering, let's not forget the true global growth engines that, never really stopped building.
Right. China and India are the models of consistent, aggressive build-out. China aims to roughly double its existing 57 GeV capacity by 2035. They have about 24 reactors already under construction. And India is similarly expanding, focusing heavily on their homegrown PHWRs. Their systems of centralized planning and state financing just allow them to execute projects much faster and more predictably.
Okay, now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the ambition gap. We have the IEA's stated policy scenario, which projects a big increase. But then there's the political pledge.
The Triple Pledge. This is where ambition meets reality's grinding gears. It's a coalition of countries, including the U.S. and its allies, aiming to triple global nuclear capacity to around 12,240 G by 2050. The goal is breathtaking, but the execution requirements are staggering.
What would achieving that actually require in terms of capital and speed?
Well, to achieve that tripling, the sheer scale of investment would be extraordinary. You're looking at $210 billion per year of investment by the 2030s.
Per year.
Per year. That's over 3 times current levels, and you'd have to sustain that for 2 decades. Plus, it implies build rates we haven't seen since the height of the nuclear boom in the 1980s. You'd have to be completing a major reactor unit, or several SMR fleets every few weeks, globally.
That sounds less like a goal and more like a massive international industrial mobilization. And can we be sure that SMRs can genuinely avoid the pitfalls that plagued large reactors like Vogtle? I mean, isn't the first-of-a-kind cost for any new technology always the highest hurdle?
That is the core uncertainty. It's a critical point for investors. The first-of-a-kind SMRs, like NuScale's first units or the TerraPower demo, they will almost certainly face high development costs and unforeseen delays. The supply chain is just now being reestablished. But the promise of the SMR model lies in its fleet deployment potential.
So if you can standardize the approval once,
Right. And then churn out factory-fabricated units 2 through 100, the cost curve should drop rapidly. If the first 2 or 3 fail financially, confidence in the entire fleet approach collapses. And that's why government support, particularly the DOE funding for the U.S. demos, is so crucial. It's absorbing that initial risk, trying to prove the model before the private sector is asked to scale it.
So while the political will is there, fulfilling that triple pledge remains a Herculean task. There's a big gap between aspiration and reality on the ground.
A huge gap. The IEA's forecast, while still positive, is much more grounded.
The nuclear renaissance, whether it's large reactors or SMRs, is only possible if you have a guaranteed, stable supply of fuel. Let's switch from reactors to the rocks, the uranium supply chain. This fuel cycle has become a crucial investment thesis in itself.
This is truly where the physics of nuclear meets the volatility of the financial markets. The planned expansion of the nuclear fleet translates directly into surging non-negotiable demand for uranium. The World Nuclear Association, or WNA, forecasts that uranium demand for power reactors is set to jump about 28% by 2030.
Just by 2030. And looking further out, that demand more than doubles by 2040, potentially exceeding 150,000 tons annually. And utilities, they have to buy this fuel, right? Regardless of price, years in advance.
It's a non-negotiable future demand, and that's why the supply gap looms so large. In the very short term, supply has been adequate. We've been relying on stockpiles and ramp-ups from existing producers. Global mine output was about 60,200 tons in 2024, up a healthy 22% from 2022. That's thanks to major players like Cameco in Canada and Kazatomprom in Kazakhstan.
But the risk is midterm. Existing mines are depleting, and the secondary supplies, the stockpiles, they're finite.
That's the crux of the supply squeeze. The WNA warns that output from current operational mines could actually fall by half by the mid-2030s if new sources aren't brought online rapidly. And given that a new uranium mine typically have a 10 to 20-year lead time from exploration to operation, the investment decisions needed to prevent a shortfall are needed now.
Right. Any delay today means a massive supply gap and price volatility after 2030.
Exactly.
The market has certainly been responding to this looming crunch. I mean, we've seen some seriously bullish price signals over the last couple of years.
Very much so. After years in the doldrums, uranium prices have been rising sharply since 2021. By late 2025, the spot price hit over $82 a pound, a multi-year peak. And this wasn't just utility demand. Analysts attribute a major part of the rally to physical funds and speculative demand.
And that leads directly to the impact of the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust.
Exactly. Funds like the Sprott Trust are buying and storing vast quantities of physical uranium. They're effectively acting as an additional consumer that removes pounds of yellowcake from the market. This reduces the supply available for immediate use. These speculative buyers are betting that the combined pressures of energy security and AI power needs will force governments to greenlight more nuclear, ensuring higher long-term prices.
And it forces utilities, who usually buy on long-term contracts, into a much more expensive spot market.
Precisely.
So beyond the raw yellowcake, the fuel cycle has other vulnerabilities, right? In processing, conversion, and enrichment.
These are critical choke points, and they carry heavy geopolitical risk. Conversion turning yellowcake into UF-Euro gas before enrichment saw a major supply crunch. Prices spiked. It was so severe it prompted Cameco to reactivate and reopen its Canadian conversion plant in 2023, a direct reaction to market tightness.
But the largest strategic vulnerability lies in enrichment, especially when we're talking about those advanced reactor designs.
You're referring to high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HLEU. Traditional fuel is enriched to less than 5% U-235. HLEU is uranium enriched to roughly 15% to 20%.
And advanced reactors need this.
They need it. It allows them to be smaller, run hotter, and operate longer without refueling. But the critical strategic problem is that Russia is currently the only country producing HLEU at a commercial scale globally.
That's an immediate supply risk for any Western utility planning to deploy those Gen 5 reactors we mentioned.
It creates an enormous dependency. So Western sanctions risk has spurred a swift government-backed response. In late 2025, the U.S. Department of Energy announced $2.7 billion in contracts with companies like Centrus and Orano to rapidly develop a domestic HLEU supply chain by the late 2020s. It's an expensive, concerted effort to create a strategic national supply from scratch.
So geopolitical risk isn't just a concern for natural gas. It is woven into every single stage of the nuclear fuel supply chain.
It's absolutely unavoidable. Russia's Rosatom still controls a large share of global conversion and enrichment capacity, and Kazakhstan, which provides about 40% of the world's uranium, ships much of that output through Russian territory, creating another potential disruption point. Even localized instability like the 2023 coup in Niger immediately raised concerns about supply reliability to France.
So what's the definitive investor takeaway here? How do you play this market tightening that we expect by the early 2030s?
Industry experts are clear. There's no immediate shortage, but the market will tighten considerably. The demand surge, coupled with long lead times for new mines, means prices are likely to test and possibly break $100 a pound. That's the price you need to incentivize new mines. This outlook is spurring significant investment in established miners like Cameco and also boosting ETFs like URA. The focus has shifted from managing inventory to securing future production. It's a major structural shift from a buyer's to a seller's market.
We've established that the power generation side is moving rapidly. Now let's pivot to the crucial infrastructure that has to deliver that power. This is the bottleneck that threatens to choke off all those clean energy and AI ambitions: transmission and the electric grid.
This is arguably the most critical, yet chronically underinvested piece of the entire energy transition puzzle. We can build all the solar farms and SMRs we want, but if the electrons can't move from point A to point B, the entire effort just stalls. Over 40% of grids in advanced economies are already 20 years old or more. They're literally aging out, just as we demand exponentially more from them.
The scale of investment and construction required here is genuinely mind-boggling. I saw one analysis that said the world must add or replace over 80 million kilometers of transmission lines by 2050. That's effectively rebuilding the entire global grid in the next 25 years.
And that task requires doubling our current investment levels globally to more than $600 billion per year by 2030. Why the urgency? Two core drivers are colliding. First, the spatial mismatch. You need to integrate massive, distant renewable capacity like solar in the desert or wind in the Midwest to the dense load centers on the coasts. Second, you have surging load growth from electrification and, crucially, that concentrated, intense demand from the new data centers.
So if the grid isn't strengthened and extended, even the best clean energy projects will be stranded. It's truly the great traffic jam of the energy transition.
That phrase should absolutely be adopted by policymakers, and the severity of this constraint is nowhere clearer than in the U.S. interconnection crisis.
Yeah.
It's a bureaucratic nightmare.
Let's detail that backlog because it perfectly illustrates the severity of the bottleneck.
At the end of 2023, there was a stunning 2,600 gigawatts of generation and storage capacity, 95% of which was solar, wind, and batteries, stuck in U.S. grid interconnection queues.
2,600 gigawatts.
To put that into perspective for you, that is more than double the entire existing U.S. fleet capacity. This massive volume of clean energy is theoretically shovel-ready, but logistically stranded.
And these projects just languish, tying up billions in development capital.
They do. The median timeline from a request to interconnection now stretches beyond 4 years. And this delay dramatically increases project costs. So most projects, a staggering 90% or more, are ultimately withdrawn because the costs for grid upgrades or just the delays become prohibitive. FERC did issue major reform rules in 2023 to try and streamline this, but it will take years to clear the backlog.
And even if you clear the queue, the nightmare of permitting new interstate transmission lines is debilitating. You mentioned the Transwest Express taking a decade just for paperwork.
The permitting process is a political and legal maze. Unlike pipelines, there is no single unified federal permit for interstate power lines in the U.S. You must win approval in every single state the line crosses, facing endless local opposition, the NMBY sentiment. The 732-mile Transwest Express HVDC line took over a decade just to permit before construction finally began in 2023. That decade of delay has a real, measurable economic and emissions cost.
And that cost isn't theoretical. Grid bottlenecks aren't just causing cancellations, they are directly affecting consumer bills.
That's right. For example, the interconnection rush from data centers in the U.S. PJM service area led to a documented $9.3 billion increase in capacity market costs. Essentially, the grid operator had to pay generators much more to ensure local reliability because the transmission system couldn't move power where it was needed. And ultimately, those costs get passed down to you.
And if we look at the climate mandate, the grid bottleneck is actively slowing down the energy transition itself.
It is, and the data is alarming. A Princeton study warned that if the U.S. continues its recent glacial pace, about 1% growth in transmission capacity per year, it would forfeit about half of the potential emissions reductions projected by 2035. The clean energy is generated, but it can't get delivered. To stay on track, transmission additions must roughly double. It's the absolute linchpin.
The constraints are immense. Let's look at the solutions and the capital flowing into them. Grid modernization isn't just about new lines, it's about making the whole system smarter and more resilient.
Reliability is paramount, especially after catastrophic outages like the Texas winter blackout in 2021 or California's wildfire shutoffs. Modernizing the grid involves advanced hardware, high-voltage direct current or HVDC lines for efficient long-distance power transport, and dynamic line rating systems which use real-time data to maximize current flow over existing lines, and, of course, grid-scale batteries.
And the key to making all those complex elements work together is digitalization and AI.
Absolutely. The grid is becoming a real-time digital network. We're seeing AI-driven analytics for predictive maintenance identifying failing transformers before they happen, and for smart grid systems that actively balance the load from millions of distributed resources like rooftop solar and EV chargers. The grid has to evolve from a one-way street to an active, adaptive network.
And this transformation is already hitting the earnings reports of major equipment suppliers. The CEO of ABB noted this specifically in 2025.
Yes, ABB reported double-digit growth in its electrification business. A significant part of that was driven by utilities investing precisely because power consumption is surging in data centers, the clear impact of the AI wave.
Yeah.
That corporate confirmation tells you that new, intense loads are forcing immediate infrastructure upgrades.
And when we look at this monumental challenge, the contrast between regions that can centrally plan their infrastructure and those that can't is stark.
China is the textbook example of centralized, aggressive planning. They recognize the need to move vast amounts of power from resource-rich areas to coastal megacities. So they've built tens of thousands of kilometers of ultra-high voltage lines. This capability allows them to move bulk power over 2,000 miles with minimal loss. Their annual investments just dwarf everyone else's.
Whereas in the U.S., progress is incremental despite federal funding. The regional political fragmentation slows everything down.
It remains an incremental, laborious process. Europe is also pushing forward, especially with critical cross-border interconnectors and offshore wind grid hubs. But even their spending needs to roughly double. The good news is that both the policy focus and the capital are finally shifting toward this chronically underinvested sector.
So who profits directly from this essential trillion-dollar build-out? Let's identify the key beneficiaries.
The pick and shovel play is clear and exceptionally strong right now. In construction, Quanta Services, ticker PWR, is a leading North American contractor. Their project backlog surged to record levels, a massive $35.8 billion in the second quarter of 2025. And this is high-quality backlog, driven by multi-year utility commitments for grid hardening and expansion.
And on the equipment side, where the technology lies, who's supplying the actual hardware?
That's where the global industrial giants come in. Companies like ABB, Schneider Electric, Siemens, and Eaton. They're reporting rising orders across the board for crucial components: transformers, substations, switchgear. ABB's electrification segment, for instance, saw orders jump 16% in mid-2025, significantly boosted by those data center investments we mentioned.
There's even a thematic play for investors targeting this specific trend.
Yes, the market recognizes this is a sustained secular theme. The First Trust NASDAQ Clean Edge Smart Grid ETF, ticker GRID, holds a basket of these grid-exposed names, and it has outperformed the broader S&P 500 by roughly 60% over the past 5 years. It reflects the market's view that reliable power infrastructure is becoming an increasingly valuable asset class.
We've addressed generation and transmission. Now let's dedicate this segment to separating the hype from the reality of AI-driven power demand. The numbers sound huge, but what do they really mean?
We have to start with the dramatic growth figures but maintain perspective. In 2024, data centers worldwide consumed an estimated 415 terawatt-hours. That was about 1.5% of global electricity consumption.
Okay, so a low number globally.
A low number globally, but it's projected to more than double to about 945 TW by 2030, reaching just under 3% of world consumption. That projected growth rate is roughly 4 times faster than the growth of overall global power demand.
And the main driver here isn't traditional servers, it's the exponential adoption of those power-hungry AI servers.
Correct. The use of accelerated AI servers, those running GPUs, is projected to grow about 30% annually. They'll account for nearly half of all incremental data center demand through 2030.
But if the global share is only projected to be 3% by 2030, why the panic? Why the alarm bells about AI breaking the grid?
The reality check is critical. The problem is not national or global scale. The problem is local concentration. Data centers aren't spread evenly. They cluster heavily where land is cheap, fiber is robust, and power was cheap or available. This localized impact creates severe, potentially crippling strain on regional grids.
Let's focus on Northern Virginia again, the world's largest data center hub. The data point here is stunning.
It is. By 2023, data centers in Northern Virginia consumed approximately 26% of all electricity in the state. Imagine one single industrial sector consuming 1/4 of a state's entire electrical supply. It places immense stress on local transmission. Similarly, in Dublin, Ireland, the local grid operator had to halt new data center connections because the sheer volume of proposed projects risked overwhelming the city's power supply entirely.
That puts the scale into frightening perspective. A single modern facility can draw power equivalent to a small city.
Precisely. One typical AI-focused hyperscale data center consumes as much electricity as 100,000 households. The next generation of facilities could use up to 20 times that amount, the equivalent of 2 million homes. These are massive, continuous baseload demands being dumped onto regional grids that were not designed for this.
Data center operators were historically masters of energy efficiency, keeping energy use flat in the 2010s. Is the physics of AI finally breaking that efficiency paradox?
It is, for now. While operators still pursue every efficiency gain, the fundamental power density of AI chips is outpacing those gains. AI chips consume 2 to 4 times more power than traditional CPUs, and they require intensive liquid cooling. The demand curve is currently steeper than the efficiency curve.
This leads us to the most underappreciated aspect of the AI power narrative, its role as a catalyst for investment in reliable baseload power. Tech companies are becoming major power procurers.
That is the crucial symbiotic loop. Tech companies require guaranteed, carbon-free, reliable baseload power to maintain service and meet their own sustainability goals. They are proactively seeking long-term power purchase agreements with nuclear startups like Oklo and Nuscale, essentially committing to buying future power output to get the projects financed.
And we're seeing concrete examples of tech companies reviving assets the utility industry had written off.
Absolutely. This is real capital in action. 2 retired U.S. nuclear plants, 3 Mile Island Unit 2 and Gwen-Arnold in Iowa, announced plans to restart or be repowered specifically to supply nearby data center demand. Tech operators are effectively stepping into the gap, bringing new funding and rationale to the power infrastructure space. This is the direct opposite of the AI will eat the grid fear. AI is financing the grid.
So when we strip away the hyperbole, AI is less an apocalyptic threat and more an accelerant for massive necessary infrastructure investment, albeit creating severe localized constraints.
It is a critical growth driver, but one that perfectly reinforces the broader need for resilient baseload infrastructure. It's forcing utilities and policymakers to accelerate long-term planning for both generation capacity and grid resilience.
So now we shift gears to the outlook. The market is massive. The trends are compelling. Where should we focus our attention over the next decade? Let's start with the short term, the next 6 to 12 months.
The short-term focus is squarely on policy confirmation and whether the large project bookings are successfully translating into profit. On the policy front, watch for the EU's electricity market reform. In the U.S., look for tangible licensing milestones from the NRC, like issuing early site permits for the first SMR units. These are non-negotiable prerequisites.
And for investors, how do we confirm these trends are translating into profit and not just backlog?
We need to see confirmation in the earnings calls of key players. For a uranium producer like Cameco, watch how their contract volumes impact their realized prices. For transmission builders like Quanta Services, look closely at their backlog conversion into actual revenue, and critically, whether their margins improve.
What are the immediate risks that could derail this short-term momentum?
Geopolitical shocks remain the primary risk. A new round of sanctions directly hitting Russian uranium exports could send prices spiking overnight. That would be financially positive for uranium equities, but a massive shock for utilities. And we must watch for extreme weather events, which will test grids and draw urgent market attention to companies providing reliability solutions.
Moving to the medium term, the next 3 to 5 years, roughly 2026 to 2030. This is the critical make-or-break execution period.
This period is the trial by fire for SMRs. We need definitive validation of the first-of-a-kind projects. If Canada's Darlington SMR, aiming for 2029, is successful and hits its timeline, it could trigger a true fleet approach and unlock global orders. Similarly, the U.S. demos Natrium and Z100 must hit their 2030 startup targets. If they falter, enthusiasm will cool rapidly.
And the uranium crunch is projected to tighten considerably during this medium term.
Absolutely. The WNA projects that demand starts definitively outstripping supply in the early 2030s. The latter half of this decade is when physical market tightness is likely to push uranium prices to test that $100 per pound level. That's the price signal needed to incentivize the construction of brand new mines.
This period is also pivotal for the essential grid ramp-up.
We anticipate a notable ramp in transmission construction starts by 2027 in the U.S., assuming FERC reform starts to bear fruit. In Europe, the core mission is connecting massive offshore wind capacity. That requires concurrent, aggressive onshore and subsea grid expansion, fueling the earnings of equipment suppliers.
And if those grid upgrades lag, we should expect more localized pain driven by AI demand.
Exactly. Data center power use may be double today's level by 2028. If grid planners fail to keep pace, we will see hot spots where tech firms are forced to pause builds or invest heavily in self-generation, driving those nuclear deals even faster.
Finally, the long term, 10 years and beyond, 2035 and out. What are the structural foundational shifts we should anticipate?
By 2035, the grid will be fundamentally transformed. Renewables could easily be 50% or more of generation in major economies. The grid will be much smarter and highly automated, using real-time AI control systems to balance millions of distributed resources, from rooftop solar to vast EV charging networks. We could even see supergrids connecting entire continents.
And nuclear's role will evolve from centralized monoliths to something more decentralized.
We could see the character of nuclear capacity shift heavily toward a decentralized model, with dozens of 300 milliW SMRs co-located with industrial sites, military bases, or massive data center campuses. And this is the time frame when advanced Gen-the-Few designs may finally become commercially viable. Fusion power, while always generating headlines, likely remains a distant post-2040s possibility. Fission, particularly SMRs, will dominate this horizon.
In the long run, AI's impact shifts from a localized constraint to a strategic planning tool for nations.
The AI narrative will fundamentally influence long-term policy. Nations may begin to treat guaranteed, reliable, and carbon-free electricity supply as a key comparative advantage to attract high-value industries. The core conclusion for the future is structural. The need for robust, clean power is the unassailable foundation of the digital world.
So what does this all mean for us? Our core conclusion from this deep dive is that the nuclear revival, the massive grid expansion, and the disruptive AI power demand are not separate challenges. They are three powerful, interconnected forces driving a historical and mandatory reinvestment in our foundational energy systems.
We are seeing capital channeled across the entire supply chain, from exploration companies seeking uranium to engineering firms building HVDC lines. All of this investment is motivated by the same fundamental, unyielding need for reliable, continuous electricity.
The final takeaway for you, the learner, is simple but profound. We have definitively entered the age of electricity. Reliable power infrastructure, from the security of uranium mines through the standardization of SMRs to the resilience of transmission lines, is the essential foundation of the modern global economy and the entire digital future.
And that leaves us with a provocative thought to explore on your own. If AI is the technology driving this unprecedented demand and stressing the physical infrastructure, creating that traffic jam we discussed, could AI itself be the core solution to the infrastructure bottleneck? Can it optimize not just the energy market, but the fundamental engineering and real-time control of the grid, making the same physical assets far more efficient than traditional planning ever allowed? It's a compelling future where the driver of demand and the solution to the crisis might, surprisingly, be the very same technology. See you all in the next ProTicker Deep Dive.